the first program that came along, which was in about 1970, was the Section 236 and the 235 program. And these programs provided financing to private developers and encouraged nonprofit developers to be able to get 1% below market financing to rebuild the areas that people were being displaced from. And so,
1%, can you explain that again?
The way the program worked is the government made a funding available through for-profit developers that were willing to build affordable housing, and it provided that 1% financing below market. So that the advantage was they were able to get cheap financing to rebuild this area. And the interesting thing about this is that we talk a lot now today about faith-based development. Well, the majority nationally of developers who did 236 housing were faith-based organizations, nonprofits that created housing development corporations. Because after Southwest and after Columbia, the next major area for redevelopment was called Northwest Number 1. And here we are going to correct all the errors of all the things we didn't do. So now we have public policy that says people have to be paid uniform relocation benefits. We say that there's a resource to allow us to redevelop this area and put in affordable housing. And so there are other public policies that are starting to occur. So Northwest 1 provided for a number of things. It provided for the first right to return, so that any person who was being displaced had the ability to have a first consideration for return to this area. And so this was the first time you started seeing articulation of this strategy around first right to return, because now we thought we had the tools to assure that people who were being displaced, who were getting benefits, would be able to return and benefit from what was being redeveloped, in most cases which was being built by nonprofit faith-based organizations. And Northwest 1 was where I started my career in 1967. And I came in to that job initially as a director of really programming to realize that there were a lot of people who lived in this Northwest 1 area who needed to have services. And so I came in designing programs, and ultimately in a year became the director of this project of Northwest 1. We built 1,800 units of all affordable housing for low and moderate income persons. And a significant number of people who were displaced, in fact, did come back to take advantage of the housing units that were being provided, because they were all rental, with the exception of about 150 units which were built for home ownership. We also, interestingly enough, invented during this period of time the first modular housing development. We built 38 units of modular housing using manufactured housing thing, because the reason that happened was because HUD was going through a program in the late 60s. It was called Operation Breakthrough. And what they were looking at were new techniques for being able to build affordable housing quicker, cheaper, and having the opportunity to be able to do that. And so they were looking at all these creative systems that were being developed. And so people were jumping on that because there was a lot of money. And what HUD did, they funded a number of developers who came in and did these. But if you looked at the housing, at that development strategy, what you saw were a lot of, I love to go to housing conferences because they'd have all these developers who were trying to push these different models. And the thing was, most of them were in violation of local housing, state housing codes. And so they couldn't be built because of the fabrication, because of the technique. And so you had a lot of builders who were building stuff sitting on the sides of railroads because they couldn't market it. They couldn't sell it in local markets. So this was happening in Northwest 1. That was an innovation that we did, just to try 38 units.
Not familiar with terms like modular housing. What do you mean by that? And also, when you say affordable housing, do you mean Section 8, or can you talk a little bit about the financing? Okay.
Modular housing is just a technique, a building construction technique. You have both modular and manufactured housing. Modular housing is where you're building sections of it, like roof truss and side walls and things like that, and you bring them as a panelized situation to a site and reconstruct them on the site. That's modular. Manufactured housing is where they are actually in a plant building an entire unit that is again brought to the, sometimes brought to the site intact and just set down on top of a slab and put in operation. Now, affordable housing, when I say that now, it meant something different in 1950 than it does today. And a lot of the definition of affordability housing came as a result of the Brooke Amendment in 1968. And the Brooke Amendment was for the first time, it was in 1969, it did two things. It set a standard that most public housing authorities established flat rents. Meant it was based upon the size of the unit, they had flat rents, which we would call market rents. And public housing was never designed to be the housing of permanency that's become today. It was designed for temporary housing for people who were returning from the Korean War. And so it was designed to be a transition between their coming back, readjusting, and then moving into the normal market. But then in 1969, when the Brooke Amendment was enacted, it did two things. It said that public housing authorities now had to set it on the basis of income, that no family would pay more than 25% of their adjusted income for housing, for public assisted housing. And that had a tremendous impact. What was the impact? The impact was that here you have an authority that's operating on flat market rents. And now the government says that you cannot charge more than 25% of a person's adjusted gross income. So that means that the difference between their affordability and what they could pay at 25% was significantly different than what they were paying for flat rents. And so they created a tremendous operating gap for public housing authorities. And the response was that HUD came along and increased the amount of operating subsidy that they were providing to public housings to close that gap. And that happened for a number of years until I'll show you what happened. And we are right back to the same problem today that we faced back there when the Brooke Amendment was enacted. But a lot of people feel that the Brooke Amendment was really what led to the housing of very low and low income people, because there was this income test that had to be met now to move into public housing, while before it was not.
So Johnson administration or Nixon?
That would have been 68 would have been
the transfer from one to the other.
Well, yeah.
So we still had kind of a war on poverty
going on, yeah, and I'm going to get to that too. So here we have a reaction across the country to trying to build in now new public policy in the way in which we're going to undertake these large-scale redevelopment projects. So urban renewal was still the same until about 1970. Let me go before I go to there. In 1968, there were a lot of things that happened in this country. And one of the major things that happened in this country were the civil riots in every major city that occurred. And in DC, the District of Columbia, up at the time we did that, there were a number of corridors that had already been designated as urban renewal, or became designated as urban renewal in '68 as a result of the riots. So the major riot corridors, 14th Street Northwest, 8th Street Northeast, the Shaw Urban Renewal Area, major areas that were destroyed by the riots became themselves designated as urban renewal areas as a strategy for redevelopment. And so you had 68. 1968 also was a period of time, a lot of people don't know this, that the Community Reinvestment Act was put on the books. The Community Reinvestment Act was a statement that said that banks and other institutions that were depository institutions and collected money had to begin to put their money back into the neighborhoods and communities in which it came from. And it wasn't strategy to look at that time, what was going on around redlining. This was on the books in 1968, but the enactment of CRA did not occur almost really aggressively until about mid-70s. So it was on the books for almost 10 years, but nobody ever did anything about the enforcement of the Community Investment Act. So, but this became a seminal piece of legislation. So the other thing that happened in 1968 to 70 period was a changing in the thinking around how you do redevelopment. And so instead of a large-scale urban renewal strategy, they came up with a program that was called the Neighborhood Development Program. And so instead of doing this large-scale redevelopment that we were doing before, instead you had to take a sub-area, a smaller neighborhood, and do this.